The wrestling world has been rocked to its absolute core, and what I'm about to tell you will make your blood boil with the disgusting way certain people in this industry have responded to a genuine medical emergency. While Paul Heyman was fighting for his life in a hospital bed after suffering a massive heart attack, there were actually people within WWE's corporate structure who saw this as nothing more than a business opportunity. Yes, you heard that right, as the wise man lay unconscious with his family praying beside him, corporate vultures were already circling, discussing how to restructure creative without Heyman's influence. But here's what's going to absolutely infuriate you: when Triple H, the man who many consider the cold, calculating corporate machine, heard the news about Paul's condition, he broke down in tears right there in the middle of a board meeting. And instead of showing compassion, instead of showing basic human decency, certain unnamed executives actually had the audacity to tell him to compose himself because this was a business meeting. I'm not making this up, folks. This is the disgusting reality of how corporate WWE operates when cameras aren't rolling. The hypocrisy is absolutely sickening. These are the same people who post touching tributes on social media, who talk about the WWE family in press releases, who preach about caring for their talent and staff. But when a true legend of this industry, a man who has dedicated his entire life to professional wrestling, is literally fighting for his life, their first instinct is to protect their bottom line and maintain their precious corporate image. Let me paint you the full picture of what happened, because the mainstream wrestling media is too scared, too bought and paid for, to tell you the complete truth about the absolute chaos that erupted behind the scenes when Paul Heyman collapsed during what should have been a routine creative meeting last Tuesday afternoon. Paul Heyman wasn't just having a regular day at the office. He had been pulling 18-hour days for 3 straight weeks, working on multiple storyline rewrites, handling talent relations issues that nobody else wanted to touch, and somehow managing to keep the creative ship afloat while dealing with constant pressure from corporate to deliver ratings that would satisfy their impossible expectations. The man is 58 years old, has a documented history of high blood pressure, and yet WWE's executive team continued to pile responsibility after responsibility on his shoulders because they knew he was too dedicated, too passionate about this business, to say no. According to multiple sources who were present in that creative meeting, and yes, I have confirmed this with 3 separate individuals who were in that room, Paul had been looking visibly exhausted and stressed for weeks. He was constantly rubbing his chest, complaining about shortness of breath, and had even mentioned to several colleagues that he didn't feel right, but felt pressure to keep working because of upcoming television deadlines and the constant demand for content. Then, at approximately 2:47 p.m. Eastern Time on Tuesday, while in the middle of explaining a complex storyline involving multiple championships and talent from different brands, Paul Heyman suddenly stopped mid-sentence, grabbed his chest, and collapsed forward onto the conference table. The sound of his head hitting that table echoed through the room, and for a moment, nobody moved. They were frozen in shock, unable to process what they were witnessing. But here's where this story gets absolutely disgusting, and I want you to really think about this as I tell you what happened next. While Paul Heyman lay unconscious on the floor of that conference room, while medical personnel were being called, while his assistant was frantically trying to reach his family, there was one executive, and I'm not naming names because legal has advised against it, but those in the know will understand who I'm talking about, who actually said, and I quote, "Well, I guess we need to figure out who's taking over his responsibilities. Not, is he okay? Not, what can we do to help? Not, should we postpone this meeting?" No, the first concern was business continuity. The first priority was making sure the corporate machine kept running smoothly, regardless of whether one of their most valuable and dedicated employees lived or died. Triple H, to his absolute credit, completely lost it at that moment. According to witnesses, he stood up so fast that his chair flew backward, slammed his hands on the table, and screamed, and I mean screamed, at that executive in a way that nobody had ever heard before. He called them soulless, heartless, and used several other words that I can't repeat on this platform without getting demonetized. But the most telling moment came when he looked around that room at the faces of people he had worked with for decades and realized that most of them were more concerned about the business implications than about Paul's life. That's when Triple H broke down. This man who has cultivated an image of being tough, calculating, and business-focused, completely crumbled. Witnesses described him as sobbing uncontrollably, while trying to call Paul's family personally to make sure they had been notified. He insisted on riding in the ambulance to the hospital, and when he was told that only family members were allowed, he reportedly said, "Paul Heyman is my family, and if you don't let me in that ambulance, you'll have to physically remove me." But the corporate response was even more telling. Instead of showing support for their chief content officer's emotional reaction to a colleague's medical emergency, instead of recognizing that this was a normal human response to a traumatic situation, they actually criticized Triple H for his unprofessional behavior and suggested that he needed to maintain better emotional control in crisis situations. Let that sink in for a moment. The man who has been running their creative department, who has been responsible for some of the best storylines and character development in recent WWE history, who has proven his business acumen time and time again, was being criticized for showing human emotion when a close friend and colleague nearly died in front of him. The ambulance ride to the hospital revealed even more about Triple H's character and his genuine relationship with Paul Heyman. Paramedics later told hospital staff that Triple H spent the entire 15-minute journey holding Paul's hand and talking to him, even though Paul was unconscious. He kept saying things like, "Come on, Paul, you've got too many stories left to tell," and, "Your family needs you, the business needs you, I need you." When they arrived at the hospital, Triple H immediately took charge of the situation in a way that showed his true leadership qualities. He made sure Paul's family was contacted and brought to the hospital as quickly as possible. He arranged for the best cardiac specialists to be brought in for consultation. He even personally called Paul's ex-wife to make sure she was informed, despite the fact that they had a complicated relationship, because he knew that Paul would want her to know. But perhaps most importantly, Triple H made it clear to hospital staff and anyone who would listen that money was no object when it came to Paul's care. He authorized the use of experimental treatments, brought in specialists from other hospitals, and essentially wrote a blank check to ensure that Paul Heyman received the best possible medical care available anywhere in the world. Meanwhile, back at WWE headquarters, the corporate machine was already moving to protect itself. Internal emails that have been leaked to several wrestling news outlets show that executives were discussing crisis management strategies and public relations approaches before Paul had even been stabilized in the ICU. They were more concerned about how this would affect their stock price and public image than about the actual human being fighting for his life. The most disgusting part of this entire situation is how WWE's corporate team tried to spin Triple H's emotional response as a weakness rather than recognizing it as proof of his character and leadership. They actually suggested in internal communications that his emotional outburst in the boardroom and his excessive concern for Paul's welfare showed that he might not be suitable for high-pressure executive decisions. Can you believe that? The man shows genuine human emotion and concern for a colleague's life, and the corporate response is to question his leadership abilities. This is exactly what's wrong with modern corporate culture, not just in wrestling but across all industries. The idea that caring about people, showing emotion, and prioritizing human welfare over business concerns is somehow a sign of weakness is absolutely disgusting. But Triple H didn't back down. Even while dealing with his own emotional trauma from witnessing Paul's collapse, even while spending every available moment at the hospital, he continued to fight for Paul within the corporate structure. He made it clear that Paul's job would be waiting for him when he recovered, regardless of how long that took. He insisted that Paul's full salary and benefits would continue during his recovery period, and he threatened to resign if anyone tried to use this medical emergency as an excuse to push Paul out of the company. The hospital vigil that followed revealed so much about the relationships and power dynamics within WWE. Triple H was there every day, sometimes for 12 or 14 hours at a time. He brought Paul's favorite books to read to him while he was unconscious. He made sure fresh flowers were always in the room. He coordinated with Paul's family to ensure that someone was always present, and he personally handled all the logistics so that Paul's loved ones could focus entirely on his recovery. But what really shows you the character of these two men and their relationship is what happened when Paul finally regained consciousness after 4 days in the ICU. The first thing he asked about wasn't his own condition, wasn't about his family, wasn't about his pain or his prognosis. The first thing Paul Heyman asked about was whether the creative meetings were still on schedule and if the storylines were being properly maintained. Triple H's response was perfect. He looked Paul straight in the eye and said, "The only thing you need to worry about is getting better. Everything else can wait. The business will survive, but we need you to survive first." That's real friendship. That's real leadership. That's the kind of character that you can't fake and you can't teach. The recovery process has been slow and challenging, but it's also revealed the true nature of relationships within WWE. While Paul has been overwhelmed with genuine support from wrestlers, writers, and production staff, the corporate response has been noticeably cold and calculated. They've done the bare minimum required by law and company policy, but there's been no genuine warmth or concern from the executive level. This entire situation has exposed the fundamental divide within WWE between the people who actually care about wrestling and the people who see it only as a business opportunity. Triple H's emotional response and continued support for Paul Heyman proves that he's still connected to the human side of this industry, that he hasn't been completely consumed by the corporate machine. But it also shows how isolated he's become within his own company. The fact that other executives criticized him for showing emotion, for prioritizing a friend's health over business concerns, for refusing to treat a medical emergency as just another corporate crisis to be managed, reveals the toxic culture that exists at the highest levels of WWE. Paul Heyman's heart attack was a medical emergency, but the response to it has become a moral emergency that exposes everything wrong with corporate wrestling culture. The fact that Triple H had to fight his own colleagues to ensure proper care and support for Paul shows just how far the company has drifted from its stated values of treating talent and staff like family. This story isn't just about one man's medical crisis or another man's emotional response. This is about the soul of professional wrestling and whether the people running these companies actually care about the human beings who make it all possible. Triple H's tears weren't a sign of weakness. They were proof that he's still human in an industry that seems determined to squeeze the humanity out of everyone involved. The mainstream wrestling media won't tell you these details because they're too afraid of losing access, too concerned about maintaining their relationships with WWE's corporate communications team. But this is the truth about what happened, and it's a truth that every wrestling fan deserves to know. Paul Heyman is recovering, slowly but steadily, thanks in large part to Triple H's insistence on the best possible care. But the real question is whether WWE as a company will learn anything from this crisis, or if they'll continue to prioritize business concerns over basic human decency. What do you think? Should Triple H have been criticized for his emotional response, or should he be praised for showing genuine leadership and compassion? How do you feel about WWE's corporate culture based on their handling of this crisis? Let me know in the comments, because this conversation is far from over, and the wrestling world needs to have a serious discussion about what kind of industry we want this to be. If you thought tonight's story was wild, trust me, what happens next will blow your mind. So don't stop now. Click on the video right here on your screen to continue the chaos, the drama, and the inside scoop only we deliver. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and join the Wrestling News CC family, where the real stories of WWE come to life. See you in the next one.